Hi, friends. Welcome back. So, did the Fed make the right decision by cutting rates by 50 basis points? That's the subject of today's video. And in fact, we have some new data points out today, which I want to chat with you about. And let's jump right in. So, first, I got an email from one of my banks, and it said, Yo, your savings account rate is going down from 5% to 4.5%. So, it was like effective immediately. And I just got the email. And I'll be curious if you guys have gotten any of these emails yet. I think pretty soon all the banks will be sending out there because they have to let you know that rates are changing. And it's interesting because, for me, I really like that sweet 5% interest rate on savings accounts, but I understand this is a double-edged sword, right? So if you make interest rates high, it benefits people who are saving, but really, really hurts people who are borrowing. So, one of the things that a lot of people are doing, and in fact, we have a number on this, 61% of Americans have said, yo, if rates come down, to levels that I like, I will be more interested in buying a car, buying a house, right? Basically buying more stuff because it's more attractive to borrow money. If rates are too high, so for example, you go to the bank and they tell you, hey, you can buy a house, but like the mortgage rate is, 10%. You're like, oh my God, I'm not getting a 10% mortgage. Screw that. I'll wait for rates to go lower, right? So that's sort of, how this has an effect on people's behavior. What's interesting about this stuff, though, and again, we're trying to set rates to, maintain growth, but also to not set too low or too easy to borrow money to where it drives inflation. And one of the interesting things is that, and I've mentioned before on the channel, when the Fed said, hey, we're doing 50 basis points, they have to convince you that everything's okay, right? That we're not cutting because we're worried. We're cutting because things are good. That's sort of what the case they're going to make. Fed Waller actually came out and gave an interview on CNBC. It was an interesting one. So basically what he was saying is like, yo, you all a bunch of fools. You're looking at, consumer stuff. We're looking at producer stuff, right? So forget you consumers, look at producers. And in fact, according to him, inflation is coming down faster than he thought it would be. And hence we need to cut because it's actually inflation's 2 weeks. That was pretty interesting. This is the quote here, and I'll read it for you guys. He says, inflation is softening much faster than I thought it was going to be. And that is what put me over the edge to say, look, 50 is the right thing to do. So evidently from their point of view, at least Fed Waller, they're not worried about inflation anymore. Or I should say, they're not worried about inflation going too high. They're actually worried about going too low. And so then, hey, we got to cut rates. The other thing that was fascinating, though, is that he's like, we're not worried about jobs at all. And seriously, that's what he was saying. And it was interesting because, like, for me, and I always talk jobs with you guys all the time on this channel, I see that many companies are laying off. Or even if you have a job, it doesn't pay enough to essentially make ends meet, right? So I don't know. I mean, I just told you what Fed Waller said. I disagree with it myself. I'm just like, what the heck? But we'll see if they end up being right. We'll see if they're correct that inflation, in fact, is coming down faster than we think. But I will say there's another person in the Fed Bowman. She actually dissented, so she voted against the committee. Normally, they vote in consensus. So, they have a couple-day meeting. I think there's 12 members, and they all, meet and then decide, okay, we all agree, 50 basis points, whatever. But she's like, no, maybe 25. Now, she can't really like go around the country every day and say, Fed Pal and all my colleagues are a bunch of morons. It's not really appropriate, but she can dissent, and that's what she did. And this was the first time since 2005 that a member of the Fed committee had dissented, so they don't do it very often. And it's interesting because, like I said, she won't go around the country and say, they're a bunch of idiots. But you can look at some of the past things that she said. And one of the things that I think is interesting, and I've mentioned this before on the channel, but it doesn't get talked about it enough because I know we just focus on the rate. But what are bank reserves and what is the Fed requiring the banks to hold? So the basic gist of it is, I'll give you an example. Let's say I put a bunch of money into the bank because I want to get my, sweet, well, it was 5%, but now 4.5% savings, right? That's what I want to get. The bank has to pay me on that, right? And so one of the things they do to make money is they'll take my money. And so it's on paper, but they may not actually even have my money. And then they'll lend it out to someone else, right? So let's say they pay me 4.5%, but then they lend out my money to someone else for, say, I don't know, 7%, right? And so they make money on the spread. So that's basically the idea of a bank. Now, the thing is that's really interesting about this stuff with the bank, and I don't want to scare you, but it's just how it is. Oftentimes they lend out way too much money. So if I go to the bank and want to get my money, and then people are like, hey, why is Chris getting his money out of the bank? And people start following me, and we all start pulling our money out of the bank. The bank that may not actually have enough cash on hand, and so one of the things that the Fed wants to do is like, hey, make sure you got enough money in there, make sure we're all okay. And this is one of the things that they'll set is how much money does a bank have to have on reserve. So Bowman would be a little bit more conservative on that, meaning that banks please have more money. The other thing too is actually the Fed as a whole wanted banks to have more money on reserve. The banks actually paid a bunch of money on lobbyists. Like I said, we talked about this before on the channel, and they got it to come down. And so the actual reserves that are required by banks is much, much lower than it was before. So in that situation, the banks and Wall Street won. The Fed like to say that they're independent, but I'm just telling you guys, it was reported widely. And I mentioned on the channel, like I said, it's not as popular to talk about bank reserves as it is, rates, but that is a real concern. So the other issue too, talking about banks, is pretty funny. JP Diamond, he came out and said, those regular people, they're a bunch of morons. I bet you people, I didn't say morons, but he said, I bet you only like 5% of Americans even know there was a rate thing. This was actually a quote from Jamie Dimon. So the headline of the story was only 5% of everyday Americans probably know about the Fed's historic interest rate cut. And the quote was, the rate cut is a minor kind of thing. There are 320 million Americans, and if you survey them, only 5% would know about it. So, this is just sort of his conjecture, and it came across a little bit mean to Americans. Whether or not he's right or wrong, who knows, right? I will say though that after he said that, only 5% of Americans, know about the rate cut. The bank then issued like a kind of a statement after that, like, oh, you misunderstood what he said. He meant to say that everyday Americans care about the economy and blah, blah, blah. Like they tried to cover up for him, but who knows? I mean, maybe he's right. I don't know. I will say there was one survey that sort of countered that, and this was asking Americans what they think about the federal banking reserve system. 45% said it was a favorable view of our central bank. 32% said unfavorable, and 23% said not sure. And then regarding to whether or not regular Americans know about interest rates, they'll probably get an email just like I got one from my bank, and you'll find out about it soon. Or banks will send you offers and say, hey, rates are coming down on mortgages and rates are coming down on car loans. Time to buy now, right? So banks want your business, and I'm sure they'll let you know. But, like I'll if you watch this channel, you pay attention to the rates. But does the average American? I don't know. I mean, you be the judge of that. Other things going on that could affect inflation, right? Because remember, I said infect, but it should be infect, but I guess it is infected, like a virus of inflation. But remember the Waller was saying, we got to look at producers, right? Producers are key. So one thing that's really interesting is Constellation Energy. I think they're going to reopen one of their nuclear plants. They call this 3 Mile Island, and they had an accident there. This is I was alive at the time, but this is well before my memory. This was back in like 1979. They had a meltdown at the plant. And then, obviously there's always concerns about nuclear power. I've said this before on the channel. I'm not an expert in nuclear power, and I don't pretend to be, but I just said that like we need to have more energy. I don't think there's any argument there. And the question is, where can we get energy that's safe, renewable, clean, etc.? Where's that going to be from? There's all kinds of problems with, different sources of energy. Be it if you want to drill, you got problems with that. Be it if you want to go batteries, you got problems with that. Be it if you want to go, nuclear, you got problems with that. Like there's no like perfectly safe, perfectly clean, cheap, reliable energy. And that's essentially, I think is going to be the gold standard of the future is like, can we come up with some sort of renewable way that has no downsides? So the nuclear thing though, the stock for Constellation Energy went up like crazy. I guess they're going to sell their nuclear power to Microsoft for Microsoft's AI stuff. And that's going to be a thing going forward. All the big companies, be it your Amazons, your Metas, I was going to say Facebook, but Meta, Facebook, the same thing, but your Apples or whatever. Everyone needs energy, right, to do what they want to do. And it was interesting. There was an estimate by Goldman Sachs talking about energy here. And because remember, we're talking about the rise of AI, they're predicting data centers, right, which is related to this, be it cloud computing, AI, et cetera. I guess is going to be like 8% of our entire energy demand in the USA by 2030. And so, like I said, I think this energy stuff won't go away. We're going to need it. And will we be sort of using more nuclear power going in the future? That's certainly a possibility. And then the other thing is too, is like, again, if you want to go with Waller's point of view that, producers' costs are coming down, you could say, hey, we're going to have cheaper and more energy out there. And that could theoretically also control for inflation, right? So there's different things you factor in with inflation when you're looking at demand. Do people have enough money do they want to buy said products, and then supply, right? Are we able to have enough of something so where there's not scarcity? So energy being something that I would say that there's always going to be demand for it, and then can we bring a big enough supply in a cheap enough way to keep prices down? So there's that. Another thing to think about inflation, I want you guys to understand how this whole system works, is pricing of things, and then like whether or not companies profit on said things. So one of the issues that I had with the Waller situation is that he's saying, yo, if producer prices are coming down, it's kind of the assumption though that the companies and the producers would pass those costs on to consumer, meaning that, for example, let's say Nike found a way to manufacture things cheaper, cut their margins, and shipping costs are lower, whatever. Would Nike then give lower prices to you? That's the question. You guys see what I'm saying here? Would they pass their margins and profits on to the consumer? So you may not necessarily see it. It depends on the company, but we are in a market. So if Nike is competing against other shoe companies and we're competing on price, then companies price things together, and then hopefully that works as a fair market. However, the market doesn't always work fair. I'm sure you guys know. And in fact, the FTC is going after the insulin market. I'm a huge fan of Lena Khan over the FTC. I mentioned this before on the channel. I can't say high enough things about her. I just think as just regular people, consumers, we benefit when companies are out to price gouges. I just think that's a good thing. But on the other perspective, if you're a Wall Street, right, and we're all shareholders of these companies, it's true. You benefit if your companies profit more, but there's a balance, right? And so, as I mentioned before on the channel, as an investor or as a worker, you want to be on both sides. Be the worker, and also you can say the third part, consumer. Be the worker, be the consumer, right? Be part of the world that way. But then also take ownership in the companies that you either shop at or the ones that you work at, so that you can enjoy the profit. So there's no, how can I say, there's no cut and dry things with this kind of stuff because sometimes people say, how does it affect my life? And I'm telling you, right? It affects your life in two different ways. How much you pay at the counter, or how much you make being an owner of a company, owning the stock as being the producer. So there's two ways. But anyway, Lena Khan is though going after drug companies regarding insulin sales, claiming there's essentially like monopoly, or if you want to say like an agreement among them, or whatever the right word you want to say, a trust. and they made a statement here. This is from the FTC. They say millions of Americans with diabetes need insulin to survive. Yet for many of these vulnerable patients, their insulin drug costs have skyrocketed over the past decade, thanks in part to powerful PBMs and their greed. That's coming from the FTC. And it says here, the FTC administration action seeks to put an end to the big three PBMs' exploitation conduct and marks an important step in fixing a broken system, a fix that could ripple beyond insulin market and restore healthy competition to drive drug prices down for consumers. Now, the drug companies, they're going to say, FTC, you're just being mean, you're playing politics, we're doing nothing wrong, lay off us, etc. So we'll see how that ends up resolving. I always say it very clearly, I'm a big fan of Lena Khan, and I think if there is indeed some sort of price fixing or something like that, by all means, go after that, because I think overall having competition in a market benefits everyone, benefits most of us, because I think it is true. If you have a monopoly in the market, you can certainly make a lot of money. But it's not really a fair system. I'm sure you guys understand this. The issue is I think with any one of these things, though, is just to have a balance, be it, with the economy, we talk about inflation, jobs, or, growth, or also too with markets, right? We want some fair competition. We also don't want to necessarily, overextend our regulation to where companies can't do anything, because that's real too. You could have too many regulations, but I feel like the pendulum have definitely swung in favor of companies and not necessarily in terms of consumers. So, and you guys can certainly have an opinion on that, and I'd like to hear your thoughts. And especially too, just regarding, say, the insulin situation, I don't have diabetes, and I don't think anyone in our family does. I'm just thinking out loud, but I do know that it is a real cost for people. And in fact, when I was in, I remember this in high school, I had a friend who had a brother who had it, and they had to do like shots. I don't know how often it was, but I remember they had to do it. Maybe it's once a week or something like that. And that's a real cost for people. So, there's some things in terms of the drug companies, it's a tricky thing, because you want to give incentives for drug companies to develop, new products and to do research and said things. So you don't want to remove profits from that kind of stuff, but you don't necessarily want to make certain kind of drugs unobtainable or inaccessible to people who need it. I'll give you a simple example of something that would be pretty nuts if it ends up being true. I guess it can happen with the dynamic pricing where companies can be like, oh, we know that people in your neck of the woods really need, cold medicine, so we're going to jack up the price for you. But in other places, it's not really needed, so we're going to kind of lower the price for you. The point being is the way that we can do digital pricing and dynamic pricing these days is you can charge more where there's high demand and charge less to sort of spur demand. It's kind of an interesting thing. But then you get unfairities, is that a word? Unfairities, or unfairness in the market, because you shouldn't necessarily be charging customers two different prices for the same product. So there's that. There's a lot of interesting things that go on with the FTC. I just wanted to bring up the dynamic pricing thing because that's something that a company can kind of cheat you on as well. There's lots of ways that companies could cheat you. And like Uber is an example of that, to where like you could have two passengers at the same spot and they may charge you each passenger differently. They also may pay each driver differently. It's a whole other rigmarole with that stuff. But these are stuff that we're able to do with digital pricing and sort of, I guess, the quote power of AI. Anyway, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this stuff. I just covered over, what's the Fed's up to and sort of what consumers and where the numbers are. So appreciate your time, and I'll catch you on the next video.